Good morning, girls. Time for our next Mrs Pepperpot story called Mrs Pepperpot and the Moose. And before I begin today, I'm just going to give you a little look at what the activity is going to be in your book so that perhaps you can be listening out for what you might need to write. So let's look at the activity book. Page called Mrs Pepperpot and the Moose. Now you can see that it's a little bit like an activity you did a couple of weeks ago before the holidays, and it's where there's a picture and next to it are a few lines so that you can write a sentence or two describing what happened in the story, what was happening there. So there's Mr Pepperpot with a pickaxe. It's a pickaxe. What's he going to do? Listen out for it in the story, girls. I will show you these pictures as I'm reading. Here's a moose peering down, looking at something. I wonder what happened there. And then, oh, Mrs Pepperpot, well, we all know she's going to shrink, don't we? It looks like she's ended up in a bucket. And what happened? I can't wait to find out. And then the last picture. There's a moose in the forest. Let's listen to this chapter of Mrs Pepperpot and the Moose. It was winter time, and Mrs Pepperpot was having trouble getting water. The tap in her kitchen ran slower and slower until one day it just dripped and then stopped altogether. The well was empty. Oh well, thought Mrs Pepperpot, it won't be the first time I've had this kind of trouble, and it won't be the last. But with 2 strong arms and a good sound bucket, not to mention the lucky chance that there's another well down by the forest fence, we'll soon fix that. So she put on her husband's old winter coat and a pair of thick gloves and fetched a pickaxe from the woodshed. Then she trudged through the snow down the hill to where there was a dip by the forest fence. She swept the snow away and started breaking a hole in the ice with the pickaxe. Chips of ice flew everywhere as Mrs Pepperpot hacked away, not looking to left or right. She made such a noise that she never heard the sound of breaking twigs, nor the snorting that was coming from the other side of the fence. And here we come to the first picture. So it's Mrs Pepperpot with a pickaxe. Wonder what the snorting is coming from the other side of the fence. But there he was, a huge moose with great big antlers, not moving at all, but staring angrily at Mrs Pepperpot. Suddenly he gave a very loud snort and leapt over the fence, butting Mrs Pepperpot from behind, so that she went head first into a pile of snow. So a moose ran up and went and butted, bump, pushed Mrs Pepperpot into the hole that she's trying to make there in the ice. Oh my goodness. So this is what the moose is looking down and seeing Mrs Pepperpot down in the cold, icy water. Oh my goodness. What the dickens? Cried Mrs Pepperpot as she scrambled to her feet. But by that time, the moose was back on the other side of the fence. When she saw what it was that had pushed her over, Mrs Pepperpot lost no time in scrambling up the hill and into her house, locking the door behind her. Then she peeped out of the kitchen window to see if the moose was still there. He was. You wait, you great big brute, said Mrs Pepperpot. I'll give you your fright, you won't forget. She put on a black rain cape and a battered old hat, and in her hand she carried a big stick. Then she crept out of the door and hid round the corner of the house. The moose was quietly nibbling the bark off the trees and seemed to be taking no notice of her. Suddenly she stormed down the hill shouting, "Walla, walla, walla!" like a red Indian, the black rain cape flapping around her and the stick waving in the air. The moose should have been frightened, but he just took one look at the whirling thing coming towards him, leapt the fence, and headed straight for it. Poor Mrs. Pepperpot. All she could do was to rush back indoors again as fast as she knew how. Now what shall I do? She wondered. I must have water to cook my potatoes and do my washing up, and a little cup of coffee wouldn't come amiss after all this excitement. Perhaps if I were to put on my old man's trousers and take his gun out, I could pretend to aim it. That might scare him off. What do you think, girls? So she put on the trousers and took out the gun. But this was the silliest idea she had yet, because before she was even halfway down the hill, that moose came pounding towards her on his great long legs. She never had time to even point the gun. Worse still, she dropped it in her efforts to keep the trousers up and run back to the house at the same time. Goodness me, that would be a sight to see, wouldn't it? Can you just imagine Mrs. Pepperpot running, skeltering back to the house and just pulling up her trousers as she's running, and a big moose behind her? She gets herself into some situations. When the moose saw her disappear indoors, he turned and stalked down the hill again. But this time, he didn't jump back over the fence, but stayed by the well, as if he were guarding it. It's as if he knows that's what Mrs. Pepperpot wants. How does he know? "Ah, well," said Mrs. Pepperpot, "I suppose I shall have to fill the bucket with snow and melt it to get the water I need. That moose is clearly not afraid of anything." So she took her bucket and went outside. But just as she was bending down to scoop up the snow, you guessed it, she turned small. She shrank. But this time the magic worked quicker than usual, and somehow she managed to tumble into the bucket, which was lying on its side. The bucket started to roll down the hill. Faster and faster and faster it went, and poor Mrs. Pepperpot was seeing stars as she bumped around and around inside. And there she is, girls, and that's the last picture in your activity, which you have to write a couple of sentences about. So just try and remember what's happening. Just above the dip near the well, a little mound jutted out. So that a little mound, it must have been like a little bit of a bump in the ground. And here the bucket made a leap into space. "This is the end of me," thought Mrs. Pepperpot. She waited for the bump, but it didn't come. Instead, the bucket seemed to be floating through the air, over the fence and right into the forest. If she had time to think, Mrs. Pepperpot would have known that the moose had somehow caught the bucket on one of his antlers. But it is not so easy to think when you're swinging between heaven and earth. So can you picture that, girls? The bucket. So the actual, that handle on the wire was hanging off the moose's antlers. They have big antlers, and it's hanging on there, and the bucket's just swinging with Mrs. Pepperpot inside. Oh my goodness. At last, the bucket got stuck on a branch, and the moose thundered on through the undergrowth. Undergrowth is all the grass and bushes and twigs that are sometimes growing low to the ground. Here's that picture, girls, of the moose in the forest. Mrs. Pepperpot lay there panting, trying to get her breath back. She had no idea where she was, but then she heard chuk, 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 the chattering of a squirrel as he ran down the tree trunk over her head. "Hello," said the squirrel, "if it isn't Mrs. Pepperpot. Out for a walk or something?" "Not exactly a walk," said Mrs. Pepperpot, "but I've had a free ride, though I don't know who gave it to me." "That was the King of the Moose," said the squirrel. "I saw him gallop past with a wild look in his eyes." And that's what he was doing in that photo, girls. "It's the first time I have seen him afraid, I can tell you that. He is so silly and so stuck up, and you wouldn't believe it. All he thinks of is fighting. He goes for anything and anybody. The bigger the better. But you seem to have given him the fright of his life." "I'm glad I managed it in the end," said Mrs. Pepperpot. "And now I'd be gladder still if I knew how to get myself home." But she needn't have worried, because at that moment she felt herself grow large again. And the next thing she knew, she had broken the branch and was lying on the ground. She picked herself and her bucket up and started walking home. But when she got to the fence, she took a turn down to the well to fill the bucket. When she stood up, she looked back towards the forest, and there, sure enough, stood the moose, blinking at her. But Mrs. Pepperpot was no longer afraid of him. All she had to do was to rattle that bucket a little bit, and the big creature shook his head and disappeared silently into the forest. So Mrs. Pepperpot found a way to scare off the moose, didn't she, girls? He didn't like the rattling of the bucket. It scared him. From that day on, Mrs. Pepperpot had no trouble fetching water from the well by the forest fence. And that's the end of the chapter, girls. I hope you enjoyed that story. I couldn't resist just to give you a little look at Louie before we start our work, girls. Post your work to your teacher